Hello and welcome to this interesting episode of Trade Gist with C. Today we'll be looking at what has happened, what has been the responses from the Trump's initial letter, of course the tariff interest that was sent across over 20 nations. A lot has happened and we'll take them just bit in bits and pieces to see what has really happened in the world of trade. Now clearly, as we do know, as reported by the BBC, you know, Donald Trump's sweeping new tariffs on more than 90 countries around the world have come into effect. And that is the announcement for us to know that there is a practicality of this threat. It used to be a threat, right? But now it is real. I want us to understand that. A moment before the deadline passed for countries to negotiate the US trade deal, of course, we saw Trump posting on his Truth social media platform that billions of dollars were now flowing into the US. And that's clearly due, of course, due to the import taxes. Trump is using this tariff to encourage jobs and manufacturing industries to return to America, among other political goals, as we know. And I did predicted this earlier on the previous episode that one of the things I see here is the US trying to boost the local manufacturing, and clearly that is what we are seeing here. Now, these drug policies have been broadly aimed at reshaping the global trading system, which is sees as treating the US unfairly. According to Trump, the US is not proper, is not fair, is not fairly treated, on in the global scale. One of the key pledge in his campaign was he's going to return to when he was returning to the White House. Was to cut the trade deficit of the US. Now there have been so much trade deficit of the US since the 90s, and this is one key thing Trump is in drastically cutting down. So, in case you're asking why all of these things, why are these things happening now? This is one of the answers you should expect. Now, before Trump took office for the second term this January, he was threatening to impose sky high tariffs on all US trading partners, no matter the existing relationship. And that's a bold move, actually, a perceived trade deficit. So, after months of announcements and delays, we saw announcements in April, right, here and there. Now the US has outlined a framework for several major trade agreements. Now, though this is not high as what we saw the last time out, but the key thing is it's significant for their supply chain in the US. Now, one thing you observe from this list, I'll just take it, if you in bits and pieces. This new tariff will see a universal tariff of 15% for countries the US runs a trade deficit with, and 10% for most countries the US runs a trade surplus with. So that means if the US imports to you more than they export from you, they peg it at 10%. Now, however, if they import less to you than that you export down to them, then there's a problem, right? So you have not much of a problem. You have 15%, but for some lanes, they've moved it from just 15% to more than that. So there's a universal tariff of 15% once you see a trade deficit, and that's why the likes of Nigeria, the likes of Ghana, you see the 15% there, right? And some other African countries. But for some, you see the 10%. That shows that the US exports, to those nations more than they import from those nations. So there's a surplus for those 10% one. Now, however, places like India, you can see the threat. There have been an additional 25% additional tariff, increase, which will make the tariff for Indian cargoes to peg it at 50% right now, right? Because this 25% plus the initial 25%, and this 25% is supposed to to take effect from the 27th of August, right? So there's still time to negotiate. However, clearly the Indian government is not taking this lightly because there has been so much move at the background, on in diversifying their trade partners now, and this is where it becomes more interesting what Indians are doing, right? Because they are looking for way out. And I'll come back to this towards the end of this session. We also see Brazil having a minimum 50% rates for some certain cargoes, of course, certain goods. Canada as well, they got that 5% for non-energy and 10% energy and potash. Now, for some trade partners, they've actually come to the table to have a good agreement that's more like for the EU's, the likes of Japan, which we saw at 25% some time ago. Now you can see that there's been quite a bit of change, you know, down to 15%, and that's because they've come to the table. So we see the likes of the Philippines, Indonesia, South Korea, Vietnam, Pakistan, and the UK. They all have range between 10 to 20% tariff right now because they've come to the table to reach an agreement, and that's quite interesting to note. The likes of China, we know the trade has been going on for a while, right? For China, the 90 days trade since May 14th, that they had an 30% imposed on them, or tariff imposed on their import cargoes from China. However, China did not just slip on their feet. China also retaliated with a 10% tariff also for goods imported from the US. Now, these things are very important we look at and understand fully, because the key drive is what is the need for Africa. And I always ask this because as African countries, what is there for us to take from all of these things happening? This is actually one of the best time to build formidable bilateral agreements, right, with these countries. And look at, for instance, like I said, I'll come back to the Indian matter. What Indian has done is they are expanding their export outreach to over 50 countries, and this includes West Asia and Africa. Uh, and because, of course, most of the India is one of the major contributors to African businesses as well as the Asian market. So they are now diversifying this across 50 countries, and it's a lesson for us. For the likes of South Africa, for instance, where there's of course the tariff hike to 30% from the US is majorly on their automobiles, the cars, and the rest. What is AFCFTA doing about this? Right, with the AFCFTA agreement, you would expect that it's easier to trade within Africa, right, for African countries, and this is the best time for our leaders to come together and take advantage of this. Because when you have cars, say, assembled or produced in South Africa, and then it's being shipped down to somewhere in East Africa, at a very interesting rate. Or where in turn, of course, what goes out, you have the tea from Kenya or so East Africa down to South Africa, and there's that bilateral agreement that boosts this trade. It helps the trade to move around, and this would so significantly impact again the poverty line in Africa, which is pegged at 50%, over 50%, right? So this would help to drastically reduce this. But then one will wonder, why is it difficult to create that? Again, the question we await, and I look forward to your responses as well as our leaders' responses. So for what Indians are trying to do, expand, this outreach to African market. This is them saying to Trump, yes, we share you, we see you, but we are not just solely dependent on your country. And that's how it should be, because bilateral trade deals should be clear. It should be a win-win for both parties. It can't be a win for you and a loss for the other party. And that's why I applaud the move by the Indians. And I just wait to see how this will play out eventually. Of course, the Canadians are not sleeping on, on it as well. Every other country, they are all looking at what to do on how to go through this, right, this episode. So it's not a thing of a win and a loss, but a win and a win. Again, global trade must continue, because that is what makes that's what drives the global economy actually. So it's important for countries to do business together, but in doing that, the end product must be beneficial, because again, it's not just the importer here. We're looking at a large chain of people involved, right? So we're for instance, this tariff comes to stay, the final consumers in the US will bear the brunt of it actually. So if you and it's going to discourage those importers from the US. So now they'll have to divert, instead of buying, these parts, say from a country A, they have to source it from country B, right? That has a lower tariff. And now, by our next episode, I will look at what are the commodities majorly affected in all of these things, right? What are those goods that we should look out for? And that would even channel how freight forwarders in this market, how other stakeholders, right, the importers, the sellers as well, how should they position themselves in a proper manner, so that this does not take of course take anyone by surprise, and as well they will be able to cash out on this, because eventually, with all of these things happening, the opportunities springing forth here and there. And I just hope that Africa will be well positioned to take advantage of this, knowing that several countries are looking for those partners. And again, sometimes it begins with us. Intra-African trade just have to be boosted up, really, because in the global scheme of things, intra-African trade is one of the least actually. It's one of the least, very, 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 very low. And this is an opportunity for us to look at that and take advantage of that. Thank you so much for listening. Let's not make this. I look forward to getting your questions. Right, you have a different thought to what I've just said, or you have something more to add, or a question. Please feel free to drop it on the comment section. Like, subscribe, and follow. So much more to come as we break down this episode on what is happening on global trade. There's so many other series to come up. Just keep tab on this page, and you'll surely love it. It's Chinedu speaking. Thank you once again for listening. Take care.